the law of interconnectedness. Human virtue affects the environment. Do we need God to explain how the universe arose? We don't need a creator God, because the thing which created the universe, according to this view of things, is in fact greed or craving in people's minds. This is the starting point. This is the thing which sets things in motion. It's not some outside force or some supernatural being who's come and raised his finger or created things. Simply through the power of things in our mind, things come into motion by themselves, by the laws of physics, action and reaction. But we're talking about things which are going on in the mind, which connect to things which happen in people's lives and hence in the universe at large. So, individuals need to be responsible for the welfare of society, because it comes down to individual actions ultimately. What the people in a society do affects how that society is. Nothing very big there, but sometimes we wait for the government to fix things for society. In fact, in those days, according to this legend, originally it didn't have a government. It didn't have a government anyway. It's only when things got really bad that people kept breaking the law, natural law, that a government was formed. Curiosity and greed are roots of evil. 5 precepts is something which occurred naturally in human history, but which we have since deviated from. And problems have come with that. And human nature, not as we described yesterday, is not guilt or sin, but if human nature in fact came from a godlike nature. But what we have left of it is depends on how much of it we practice. Originally we were good, but we have fallen from that, according to this portrayal of how things start in the beginning. But we have the potential to reach back towards that again. It depends on how much cultivation we do. The other thing perhaps I should mention is the timescales. The other thing you have in your notes is a description of how blessings in society have disappeared. I don't think this will mean very much to you unless you study the 38 blessings. But it is like there's a sort of entropy in morality of human beings, where human beings originally led a charmed life, but that charm sort of disappeared. If you understand the 38 blessings, then you can look at how these are gradually being eroded away, but how they can come back again as people practice. So next time, tomorrow it will be, we meet a little bit earlier because there's the ceremony for clipping your hair as well, but it will probably start at 1:30, and we'll finish a little bit earlier so we're in time for the ceremony. But we go on to look further at how we can work against this deterioration which seems to be built into our existence. What sort of actions can actually change this for the better or for the worse? And tomorrow we'll start looking at how this relates to what we are practicing. Now we've got the big picture, the cosmological picture. We can look at how this affects us and what we can do individually to change things. Okay, so that's all I want to say for today, but maybe you have some questions because today is quite a long shot, I'm sure. Yeah.
Whether there will be a day allocated for us to ask all the questions, or we have to ask them?
No, go ahead and ask.
Because there are a lot questions then.
But if there's more than you have time to ask, then write them down, and maybe we can have special sessions, particularly for questions. But please write them down, because in fact your questions are very useful to help us to develop the course. Because the ideal course would leave no doubts. But if there are doubts, then it must mean that there are gaps in the course.
I remember when reading that sutra that it mentions the change in food all the way through. At one point, we started to kill animals, and that led to another big diet.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like a Buddhist argument for vegetarians. We're talking about how we reverse. We talk about how we reverse things. For example, being celibate is one way of reversing the process. It seems to be lightening up the diet and being more content, and particularly not killing animals.
I think the way to understand this idea of the food available is not that people have taken an active part in changing what food is eaten. But I think, if I remember clearly from the Aggañña Sutta, it says that the first people to start out eating flesh were those who previously had disposition to have been ogres or flesh-eating beasts in their past. And from their example, others caught on to this as well. And that they had been coexisting with animals for a long time without having eaten them. But they were pushed into this because the fact that there was not the more nutritious foods were no longer available to them anymore. Why were the nutritious foods not available to them anymore? This is because of their behavior. But included in that behavior was not killing animals, but that may have had a part in it. But that was not directly what changed human beings' diet. What changed human beings was the availability of food. If there was something better than meat to eat, then human beings would eat that. There's a lot of killing which goes on which is not food related. You see that? There's a lot of killing which goes on in the world has nothing to do with getting meat to eat. So it means that the problem which creates killing in the first place is the hatred in people's minds. And what I'd like you to focus on when you are trying to find reasons for things in terms of Buddhist concepts is how what happens in people's minds generates behaviors, how much power this intention has. It's not on what food you eat which changes how you behave, but it depends on what intentions you have in your mind. This is the important thing which changes things. And once you have intentions in your mind where you no longer value the lives of other living beings anymore, then that intention itself starts to destroy a part of you. And the way to solve this is not by changing your diet, but it's by dealing with this intention which is arising in your mind. That's the only way to solve the problem at its root. As for the problem of whether Buddhists should eat meat or not, we come to this question quite early in the course. But the way this would be solved in the olden days is that people didn't kill for the meat which they ate. So, for example, in the olden days, in villages in Thailand, they would use buffaloes to plow the fields. And those buffaloes would be treated with great respect and gratitude, because without them, then the fields wouldn't get plowed. But later, when those buffaloes in their retirement eventually died of old age, then the people would celebrate and they would cut up the corpse of the buffalo, and they would take this very tough meat, boil it for probably days before it was edible, and then they would eat it. So they didn't kill the buffalo, but they would eat buffalo meat, and they had no problems with that. So they were ashamed to kill a living being. But meat eating, that's another thing altogether. They would eat carrion, in other words. So they would live the life of a vulture, but not the life of a bird of prey. And even the Buddha said that for monks there was no harm in this, to eat meat which you haven't killed yourself. Now some people, especially in the Mahayana traditions, they have a problem with this, because there are certain suttas, especially Lankavatara Sutta in the Mahayana tradition, which says that by eating meat you are supporting people to kill the animals which are providing that meat. They would say something like, when you take one pork chop off the shelf of the supermarket, then another pig has to be killed to put a new pork chop in its place. But the way we see things according to this understanding is that people make their own individual decisions. We make decisions about ourselves. If we make the decision ourselves to go and work in an abattoir, where every day, day in, day out, we are killing animals 8 hours a day, that is our decision. And our karma comes to us because of that decision, because those animals have died by our own hand. But the person who didn't order a particular animal to be killed for them to eat doesn't have a part of that killing intention in the person's mind as they are slaughtering the animal. On the other hand, if you go into a seafood restaurant and you say, I want that fish, and they say, yes sir, pull it out of the tank and chop its head off, then you have had a part in the death of that animal. So you have to make a distinction in your mind. As you meditate further, I think you find that your mind doesn't get caught up with this sorts of doubts. You take what you're given. If you haven't expressed a particular wish to eat this or that animal, and it hasn't been killed especially for you, as a monk, the Buddha said that is acceptable. What you have not seen, heard, or suspected has been killed especially for you, then you may eat it. Except for certain sorts of meat, like for example human flesh, where obviously it is setting up precedents where people want to cut off pieces of their own flesh to offer monks for a special merit or something like that. In Theravada Buddhism we don't make that connection. We don't make an economic connection.
As I understand it, in Theravada Buddhism, we do put some restrictions on this. For example, we're not allowed to eat horse meat or elephant meat. And I believe there's...
This is for monks.
Even for monks.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just trying to see, how can we, using the same principles, where we shouldn't turn down anything, we should just accept and be content with what we're given and so forth and
that's
so on.
There are 10 forms of meat which monks are not allowed to eat, but they have particular reasons why they're not allowed. For example, elephant meat, horse meat are not allowed because elephants and horses are seen as noble animals which are used for transportation. So if you use their flesh for food, then that would be seen as wasteful, or extravagant. There are other sorts of meat for carnivorous animals: dog meat, bear, leopard, tiger, lion, etc. Dogs included, for those of you who come from certain parts of Thailand where they eat dogs. These forms of meat have parasites in them. And if you eat those forms of meat, then you run a risk of damaging your own health, because you catch the parasites which are lodged in the muscle of these forms of meat. So this is why the Buddha did not recommend that monks eat them. As for snake meat, if you eat snake meat, your body acquires a smell of snake. And as a result of that, snakes can detect that and they will follow you and bite you because they know that you have been eating their comrades. So there's a reason for this. It's not a reason that you should not support the killing of certain animals. And as for human flesh, well, there was an example of this where they couldn't find meat for a monk to be served with, and someone cut a piece of their lower leg and served it up. And once the Buddha learned about that, he said that this should never happen again. He didn't want his people doing this out of faith for the monks. So 10 forms of meat. But normally it's known amongst the people who serve food to the monks that these forms of meat are not acceptable. Because some place in town they do eat dog and so on, China too. It's known. So normally you don't need to say, oh, is this tiger? Oh, is this leopard which you are serving me? Because normally it's not. And even if it were, then to say it would somehow upset the faith of people who were offering it. So normally we just concentrate on the amount of food we're eating, not on what exactly we are being served. But it's known that 10 forms of meat are not allowed. So normally you take what you're given and just concentrate on the amount, not to eat too much or too little of it.